This conference will now be recorded.
Good morning, everyone. Am I audible to everyone?
Yes,
Am I
ma'am.
audible? Yes, fine. So today's topic is on diphtheria and pertussis. Okay, fine, clear. Yeah, today we are going to discuss two topics. One is diphtheria and another one is pertussis. So coming to diphtheria, I don't think we require much introduction regarding diphtheria. You all know it is an acute toxic infection caused by Corynebacterium diphtheriae. Typically, usually by toxigenic strains that are caused by Corynebacterium diphtheria and rarely by Corynebacterium ulcerans. There is nothing much to tell regarding the etiology. You people are very well versed that it is a gram-positive bacilli. It is non-acid fast, non-motile, and you already know saw the picture like it is irregularly stained with granules. It is club-shaped swelling at one or both the ends. So the name called as Corynebacterium. Coming to the other part, we all know it is an aerobic, non-encapsulated, non-spore forming, mostly non-motile, pleomorphic gram-positive bacilli. In brief, regarding the etiology of Corynebacterium diphtheria, and it differs with the Corynebacterium ulcerans that Corynebacterium ulcerans is based on whether the urease activity is positive or not. And one more thing, whether this diphtheria is toxigenic or not. The ability to produce diphtheric toxin results from the acquisition of a lysogenic Corynebacterium bacteriophage by either Corynebacterium diphtheria or Corynebacterium ulcerans, which encodes the diphtheric toxin gene and confers diphtheria producing potential on these strains. So acquisition of this lysogenic Corynebacteriophage results in whether they are in potential in causing diphtheria toxin. The most important thing, and I already discussed, this is the acute toxic infection, toxin mediated, because diphtheria itself will not cause anything. Diphtheria toxin which is released by diphtheria is for all these the potential side effects or the potential disease causing things. So it is very contagious and potentially life threatening bacterial disease. Am I audible and clear?
Yes,
Tell
ma'am.
anyone. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
If anything disturbance is there, just tell me. It is a localized infectious disease which usually attacks the throat, nose, and mucous membrane. So coming to the incubation period, the period between the exposure to the infection and the appearance of the first clinical symptoms is called as an incubation period. You all are very well versed with the terminology, and the incubation period is for 3 to 4 days. Coming to the transmission of Corynebacterium diphtheria, it is transmitted mainly by droplet infection from infected skin lesions. Like skin lesions, you may ask, what about skin lesions? One entity is called as cutaneous diphtheria. It was there previously, and previously it was there like around 50%. This like cutaneous diphtheria is a local infection compared with the mucosal infection and is associated with more prolonged bacterial shedding, and it results in greater contamination of the environment and increased transmission to the pharynx and skin of close contacts. Rather than manifesting itself as a disease, cutaneous diphtheria is more like spreading the disease will be more in cutaneous diphtheria. So outbreaks are associated in that part with where crowding is more, poverty is more, alcoholism, poor hygiene, contaminated fomites. There, that's why infected skin lesions are uh, much more in causing the transmission of the disease. Nowadays, cutaneous diphtheria is almost decreased. Previously, it is around 50% previously, but not now. And remaining transmissions are you all know the major virulent determinant is an exotoxin that is called as diphtheria toxin. How the diphtheria toxin causing disease, so we're going to discuss in the next few slides. The basic is after binding to the host cells, the diphtheric toxin, the active subunit will interrupt the protein synthesis of the target host cell and resulting in cell death. So what does the toxin do? to the host cell is it finally inhibits one step, the protein synthesis, by binding to the elongation factor 2 and resulting in the host cell lysis and host cell death. Coming to the diphtheric toxin, it contains two parts. One is part A and one is part B. Part A, that is an active site, it finally inhibits the protein synthesis. It is specific for mammalian cells. Coming to the toxin, there are two parts. First is toxin A and two parts in toxin, that is part A and part B. What happens initially is part B, it is the important part of the toxin where it binds to the cell receptor. After that, part A is cleaved from the part B, and later on it is bound, receptor is internalized, thereby following where the part A and part B will be attached with disulfide bonds. Later on, the part A will be separated from the part B through this internalization and all these things, all this hydrolyzed part. Then part A, the next part already we discussed. So then part A, which is the active site, inhibits the enzyme, thereby resulting in blocking the protein synthesis and thereby leading to host cell and death. So these are two important parts. One is part B and part A. Part B binds to the receptor. After that, part A is released, and finally the active site is part A, thereby inhibiting the cell synthesis. This is the mechanism of action of diphtheric toxin. Coming to the pathophysiology, you know, both toxigenic and non-toxigenic Corynebacterium diphtheria causes skin and mucosal infection and can rarely cause focal infection after bacteremia. Usually, the organism remains in the superficial layers of the skin lesions or respiratory tract mucosa, including focal inflammatory reaction. You all know the major virulence of the organism lies in its ability to produce the potent exotoxin, that is 62 kilodalton polypeptide exotoxin, which inhibits protein synthesis. Once again, I'm repeating this, and causing local tissue necrosis. So the same thing, the organism usually infects and usually lies in the superficial layer, and the commonest sites are nose, pharynx and tonsils, followed by nose and larynx. The same thing, Corynebacterium diphtheria toxin, both A and B, finally it interferes with the cellular protein synthesis, leading to tissue necrosis. See, the tissue necrosis or a dense necrotic coagulum contains like organisms, epithelial cells, fibrin, leukocytes, erythrocyte forms, and it forms like a gray-brown leather-like adherent pseudomembrane. That's why the name called as diphtheria is, in Greek it is called as leather. Fine, that is the pseudomembrane. And you may write what will be there in the pseudomembrane. That is a necrotic coagulum containing all these things that we discussed. We all know removal is difficult and reveals a bleeding edematous submucosa. And what are the effects of this toxin leading to all these side effects? One is injury to the respiratory tract epithelium for formation of pseudomembrane and everything. And is also the toxin, what does it do? It causes paralysis of pharynx and hypopharynx. So paralysis is in combination with inflammation and edema of upper respiratory tract. It leads to airway obstruction. Paralysis of the palate and hypopharynx is an early local effect of diphtheric toxin. So one cannot ignore. This is the initial first manifestation. Toxin absorption can lead even to systemic manifestation. Mostly these systemic manifestations are immunological due to immunological mediation. The systemic manifestations can cause acute tubular necrosis, cardiomyopathies, or demyelination of nerves. So because of the later like demyelination of nerves and cardiomyopathy can occur in 2 to 10 weeks after mucocutaneous infection. That's why I already discussed the pathophysiology in some cases is suspected to be immunologically mediated. So it can cause local damage, forming pseudomembrane, leading, if at all, and causing airway obstruction, and systemic manifestations like demyelination, cardiomyopathy. But it takes some time, like around 2 to 10 weeks after exposure to mucocutaneous infection. Already, so another one is local manifestation. You all know that local manifestation is nasal diphtheria. Unilateral in presence with unilateral or a bilateral serosanguinous discharge from the nose, and presence with excoriation of upper lip. Coming to the faucial diphtheria, it causes redness and swelling over the fauces like tonsillar fauces areas. Exudates on the tonsils coalesces to form a grayish white pseudomembrane, already we discussed, and the regional lymph nodes will be enlarged. This is the pseudomembrane. that is noted over the posterior pharynx. It can become very large and sometimes it may obstruct even the airway, causing respiratory compromise. Coming to the signs and symptoms. So the clinical manifestations depending upon the site of location, whether it is respiratory, whether it is cutaneous, whether it is other infection to other sites, it could be anything. And the important thing is the immune status of the host and the production and systemic distribution of the toxin. On all these three things, the signs and symptoms may vary. Usually, the child presents with fever and weakness, enlarged lymph nodes on the neck, swelling of soft tissues on the neck, nasal discharge, high heart rate. High heart rate? It could be due to fever and also due to toxic cardiomyopathy, that is a late complication, or myocarditis. Coming to the first, depending upon the anatomical site of infection, first is respiratory tract diphtheria. In respiratory tract diphtheria, infection of the anterior nares is more common. We already discussed in initial slides. Shallow ulceration of the external nares and upper lip is characteristics. That also we already discussed. In tonsillar and pharyngeal diphtheria, sore throat is almost in universal early symptom. So one must not ignore if any membrane is there and tonsillar and sore throat is there. Tonsillar and pharyngeal diphtheria one should consider, especially in areas where immunization is not happening or immunization coverage is poor. And other symptoms like malaise, fever, and remaining all are already we discussed, like complications and everything. And one must, so here one point is one must differentiate with other diseases. Usually the common causes where membranes are there is exudative pharyngitis caused by Streptococcus pyogenes or Epstein-Barr virus. Another one is infective phlebitis with thrombosis of jugular veins is another entity and is rare. Mucositis in patients where undergoing cancer chemotherapy, that is one of the differential diagnoses where there also one membrane we can see. So these are all some of the differential diagnoses to differentiate diphtheria, that is especially from respiratory tract diphtheria from other diseases. And if at all if the larynx involvement is there, that is with laryngeal diphtheria, significant risk for suffocation because of local tissue edema and airway obstruction by diphtheric membrane. It is more, and it requires usually tracheostomy. We already discussed cutaneous diphtheria in the previous slides itself. The same thing. These are the complications: asphyxia causing mechanical obstruction. It may need tracheostomy, circulatory failure, and we already discussed post-diphtheritic paralysis resulting in cranial palsies like leading to aspirations, difficulty in swallowing, all those things. Coming to the non-toxigenic clinical manifestations, bacteria can also even cause endocarditis, meningitis, cerebral abscesses, and osteoarthritis. The same thing. Here we had to discuss regarding the complications, like important things like toxic cardiomyopathy, toxic neuropathy. These are the two important things one should remember, because toxic cardiomyopathy occurs in 10 to 25% of patients with respiratory diphtheria and is responsible for 50 to 60% of deaths. Usually, subtle signs of myocarditis can be detected in most patients, but usually they are seen in elderly. But this risk for significant complications correlates directly with the extent and severity of exudative local oropharyngeal disease, as well as delay in administration of antitoxin. So one must be aware of toxic cardiomyopathy. Already discussed, it takes some 2 to around 6 weeks after exposure. So one must be aware of these complications because these are life-threatening and causes serious consequences like death and everything. One must be very clear when will be this first evidence of cardiotoxicity occurs. Usually occurs after 2nd to 3rd week of illness. Usually we see pharyngeal disease improves but can appear acutely as early as 1st week of illness, a poor prognostic sign, or insidiously as late as 6th week. If it occurs as early in 1st week, it indicates that it is a poor prognostic sign. What are the clinical features in toxic cardiomyopathy? That is tachycardia, which will be disproportionate to fever, is common and may be evidence of cardiotoxicity or autonomic nervous dysfunction. We doesn't know. And other changes you can see in ECG, like a prolonged PR interval, changes in ST and T wave changes can be seen. Some may require like temporary transfer spacing. They may improve outcomes, but toxic cardiomyopathy outcomes will be very poor. Another one more thing is toxic neuropathy. It also occurs 2 to 3 weeks after the onset of oropharyngeal inflammation. It is common for hyperesthesia and local paralysis of the soft palate to occur. I already discussed like cranial neuropathies will be occurring. It occurs around 5th week. And systemic polyneuropathy has its onset like around 10 days to 2 months after oropharyngeal infection. So whenever you are writing like common things, you people will write like respiratory diphtheria, cutaneous diphtheria, but one should add a note regarding the complications. The two most important complications like toxic myocarditis, another is toxic peripheral neuropathy. These are all the clinical features. Coming to the laboratory diagnosis, you all know specific treatment is more important than laboratory diagnosis, but one must be aware if any gray membrane is there, one is not properly immunized, one should be aware of suspecting diphtheria is by isolation of diphtheria bacilli and testing for toxigenicity. That is the thing, and one must give treatment. See, the treatment we have to give is antitoxin, not antibiotics. Usually doesn't have much role rather than in preventing transmission of disease, because antibiotics acts on bacteria but does not act on the toxin which was produced by the bacteria, right? So what is the proper antidote? The bacteria releases toxin, so we have to give the antitoxin, then only the disease will halt, or else there is no point in giving antibiotics. So specific antitoxin is the mainstay of therapy and should be administered on the basis of clinical diagnosis, because it neutralizes only free toxin, because only free toxin will be neutralized by the drug, whatever antitoxin we are giving. That is not going to bind the toxin which was already bound to tissues and already disease process started. It will not halt that. It only neutralizes the free toxin. So with that point only, it is clear antitoxin efficacy diminishes with elapsed time after the onset of mucocutaneous symptoms. So that is the important thing. Antitoxin is the mainstay of treatment. Usually antitoxin is probably of no value for local manifestations of cutaneous diphtheria, but it is used prudent because the toxic sequelae can occur. And one more thing is role of antimicrobial therapy. It is why antibiotics are used. It is used to halt production from the bacteria from the localized infection, because even if bacteria is there, it is able to produce the toxin, right? So if we are giving antibiotics against bacteria, somewhat reduction of the toxin will be there. But what is the specific treatment is antitoxin, because it only neutralizes directly the toxin which was released by the Corynebacterium diphtheria. The commonly used antibiotics is penicillin and erythromycin. You all know the erythromycin dose is 40 to 50 mg per kg per day in 6 hourly, like in 4 divided doses, maximum of 2 grams per day. Another one more is penicillin. It can be given intramuscularly, like or daily procaine insulin. IM daily procaine insulin is 3 lakh international units per day if less than 10 kilos, and more than 6 lakh international units per day more than 10 kilos. You need not write every dosage. Just mention antibiotics like penicillin and erythromycin. Coming to antitoxin, how much we should use? If at all it is mild, then use 20,000 to 40,000 international units. If it is moderate, 40,000 to 60,000. Severe, it is 80,000 to 1 lakh. So doses in between 20,000 to 1 lakh. Single dose. Coming to the supportive care, like prevention, vaccination. First is supportive care. Droplet precautions are instituted for patients with pharyngeal diphtheria, and for patients with cutaneous diphtheria, contact precautions are observed until the results of cultures are negative or until the cessation of therapy. So this is the supportive thing. One must know the prognosis for every disease. Prognosis is important. At what rate the outcome will be there for the disease. Usually prognosis depending upon the virulence, already we discussed, patient's age, immunization status, and the site of infection and spread of administration of the antitoxin. These are all the prognosis part. Last is the prevention and vaccination. So I need not emphasize much regarding the vaccines, because usually national immunization schedule is very well covering all these vaccines. So the protective immunization titers at least of should be 0.01 to 0.1 international units per ml. And the vaccines like SLR pertussis vaccine in children and Tdap in adults we should give. The vaccination shots you people all know, 6, 10, 14 weeks, and one booster dose is 15 to 18 months, and then second booster dose is around 4 to 6 years of age. These are the common side effects of DPT vaccine. The only absolute contraindications for DPT vaccine is progressive encephalopathy within 7 days or any severe anaphylaxis. These are the only two absolute contraindications for DPT vaccine. There are no other contraindications, so one can give, and one must emphasize on immunization of all these 3 vaccines like diphtheria, pertussis, and tetanus. So I hope I'm clear regarding diphtheria. Shall I continue with pertussis?
Yes, ma'am.
So the next topic is pertussis. This is regarding morphology. Nothing much to tell you. This is just only microbiology. It is gram-negative, small ovoid Coccobacillus. It is non-motile, non-sporing. It is encapsulated. Freshly isolated strains of Botryella pertussis have embryo. And these are the cultural characteristics, like it is aerobic, grows optimally at 35 to 37 degrees centigrade. Complex media are necessary for primary isolation. Preferred medium is boarded genu, glycerin, potato, blood agar. Blood for neutralizing inhibitory substances formed during bacterial growth. Charcoal also serves the same purpose. There is no pointing in much stressing in all these things, because these are the things that you already know, you already covered in micro. This is a picture how the colonies of Botryella looks like small dome-shaped, smooth, opaque, grayish white refractal and glistening, resembling bisected pearls or mercury drops, surrounded by hazy zone of hemolysis. This delicate organism being killed readily by heat, like around 55 degrees centigrade for 30 minutes, drying and disinfectants. Outside the body, in dry droplets, it is said to survive for 5 days on the glass, 3 days on the cloth, and few hours on paper. So from here, we should learn something like what are the antigenic constituents and what are the virulence factors. Several antigenic fractions and putative virulence factors have been described, but their role in the pathogenesis is remained yet to be clarified. The virulence factors include filamentous hemagglutinin, agglutinogens, paractin, and fimbria. A number of toxins also include like pertussis toxin, acetylate cyclase toxin, tracheal cytotoxins, dermonecrotic toxin, and heat labile toxin. The exact mechanism of this disease symptomatology, despite of all these factors, is really remain unknown. And Botryella species share a high degree of DNA homology among virulence genes. Only Botryella pertussis expresses this pertussis toxin, which I already discussed, like number of toxins, the major virulence protein. And it has numerous proven biological activities that we are going to discuss in other slides, like histamine sensitivity, insulin secretion, leukocyte dysfunction. So through all these mechanisms, these are the proposed mechanisms of pertussis toxin causing all this disease manifestation. So coming to individual things, what filamentous hemagglutinin, what does it do? It is one of the 3 hemagglutinins produced by Botryella pertussis, the others being pertussis toxin and lipid factor. It is present on the bacillary surface and it is readily shed. It adheres to the cilia of respiratory epithelium and to erythrocytes. Besides facilitating adhesion of Botryella pertussis to respiratory epithelium, filamentous hemagglutinin and pertussis toxin hemagglutinins also promote secondary infection by coating other bacteria such as Haemophilus influenza B and pneumococci and assisting their binding to respiratory epithelium. So it itself, this toxin adheres to respiratory epithelium, and it also like doing friendship with other organisms, so promoting the secondary bacterial infections of other bacteria. So this phenomena has been termed as a piracy of adhesions. Filamentous hemagglutinin is used in acellular pertussis vaccine along with pertussis toxin toxide. That's why the preparations vary from vaccine to vaccine depending upon the component or constituents, like how much amount of filamentous hemagglutinin is there, what is the element of pertussis toxin is there. Depending upon that, also vaccines vary. Coming the important toxin, we already discussed pertussis toxin. I already told this is a major virulence protein, has proven biological activities with like histamine sensitizing factor, and already discussed like islet activating protein inducing excessive insulin secretion. Another one is leukocyte dysfunction. So these are also things. Another one is adenylate cyclase. All mammalian Bordetella but not Bordetella avium produce this adenylate cyclase. At least 2 types of adenylate cyclase are known, only one of which has the ability to enter target cells and acts as a toxin. This is known as adenylate cyclase toxin. It acts by catalyzing the production of cyclic AMP by various types of cells. Another one is heat labile toxin. It is also a cytoplasmic protein present in all the Botryella pertussis species. in all Botydella species. It is inactivated in 30 minutes at 56 degrees centigrade, but its pathogenic role is not yet clearly known. And the next is tracheal cytotoxin. So it is a low molecular weight peptidoglycan produced by all the Botydella. It induces ciliary damage in hamster tracheal ring cultures and inhibition of DNA synthesis in epithelial cell cultures. Its role in disease is also not completely known. Another one is lipopolysaccharide. It is a heat-stable toxin. It is present in all Botydella and exhibits features of gram-negative bacterial endotoxins. It is present in whole cell pertussis vaccine, but it is not considered to be a protective antigen. Next is pertactin. It is an outer membrane protein antigen present in all the virulent strains of Botydella pertussis. Antibody to peractin can be seen in blood of children after infection or after even immunization. Peractin is included in acellular pertussis vaccine. And lipopolysaccharide is there in whole cell pertussis vaccine. So see, composition varies. So coming to the clinical manifestation. You all know pertussis is a prolonged disease divided into 3 phases. One is catarrhal phase, another one is paroxysmal phase, another one is convalescent phase. The incubation period typically ranges from 5 to 10 days and maximum of 21 days. The catarrhal phase, it lasts for 1 to 2 weeks, begins insidiously after the incubation period of already we discussed 5 to 10 days. Some books give it around 3 to 12 days. Usually this phase have non-distinctive symptoms of congestion and rhinorrhea, accompanied by low-grade fever, sneezing, lacrimation, and conjunctival suffusion. As initial symptoms wane, coughing marks the next predominant phase, that is called as paroxysmal phase. It lasts almost for 2 to 6 weeks. First phase for 1 to 2 weeks, incubation period of 5 to 15 days, or in some books it gives 3 to 12 days, followed by paroxysmal phase of 2 to 6 weeks. So this is prolonged. This phase is more important. In this phase, cough starts as dry, intermittent, irritative, hacky cough, and it moves into inexorable paroxysms that are hallmark of pertussis. That's why the paroxysmal stage. The second stage, the name. See how it usually presents. A well-appearing, usually playful child usually have insignificant provocation. We need not know what is the provocation always. Suddenly expresses an anxious aura and may clutch a parent or comforting adult before beginning a cough that usually likes machine gun burst of uninterrupted cough. So the uninterrupted cough on a single exhalation, usually the chin and chest held forward, tongue protruding maximally, eyes bulging and watering, face become flushed, like face becomes purple and congested and suffused eyes until coughing ceases. This phase will occur until the cough ceases, and the loud whoop follows an inspired air traverses the still partially closed airway. This is typical whoop. And after this phase, post-active emesis is common and exhaustion is universal. Usually after this exhaustive period of cough, the child literally gets exhausted, and this exhaustion we can see as a universal symptom. Usually the number and severity of paroxysm escalate over days to a week. See, this phase is around 2 to 6 weeks. So how many paroxysm we cannot tell. Usually it starts slowly and it may increase over days to weeks and remain at that plateau for days to weeks. For suppose the peak will be increased and the peak will be at plateau phase for some days to weeks. At the peak of the paroxysmal stage, patients may have more than 1 episode hourly. So it is very frustrating. 1 episode hourly, this typical pattern of cough, almost 24 hours, 24 episodes of paroxysm. It is too much. But at the paroxysmal stage, fades into the convalescent phase. Usually convalescent phase lasts for more than 2 weeks. And during this phase, the number, severity and duration of episodes diminish. So by this first slide, you people understood there are 3 phases. Second phase is the paroxysmal phase where all the clinical symptoms like cough will be aggravating and the cough will be dry and irritating cough. They all will be discussed. And the last is convalescent phase. It may last even for weeks to months. Okay. These are all the viral and paroxysm of cough. Actually, it would be better if I placed any video, but I couldn't get. The same thing, face become red followed by blue like congestion, whoop at the end of the paroxysm. Post-active emesis is common. Number and severity of paroxysm progresses over days to weeks. Coming to the infants less than 3 months also can have pertussis, but they do not display all the classic stages of all the three phases like catarrhal phase, the paroxysmal phase, convalescent phase. Usually the catarrhal phase, which we discussed in adults, it is around 1 to 2 weeks, has last only for few days or often unnoticed, and after the most insignificant startle, and then after the most insignificant startle from the draft, light, sound, sucking or stretching, a well-appearing young infant begins to choke, like choking episodes will be there, gasp and flail extremities, with face becomes reddened. Cough may not be prominent, especially in the early phase. Whoop intermittently occurs in infants younger than 3 months of age, who at the end of paroxysm lacks stature or muscular strength to create sudden negative intrathoracic pressure. You already know negative intrathoracic pressure. All the manifestations cannot be seen in infants because of the flail chest and everything. Apnea and cyanosis can follow a coughing paroxysm, or apnea can occur even without a cough. So apnea is one of the common manifestation or the only symptom in the pertussis in infants less than 3 months of age. Apnea and cyanosis both are more common with pertussis than with neonatal infection from viruses, including respiratory syncytial virus. So remaining one of the differential diagnosis, if the child presents with apnea and cyanosis, one should be aware of this pertussis because this is the common clinical manifestation in infants less than 3 months of age. Convalescents include intermittent paroxysmal coughing throughout the first year of life, including exacerbation with subsequent respiratory illnesses. Okay, this is the if at all the presentation occurs in less than 3 months of age. These are the typical things. No classical stages. Well appearing infants begins to choke, gasp and flail extremities, reddened face, cough may not be prominent, and whoop is infrequent. Next is face will be red blue, whoop at the end of paroxysm. Immunized children have foreshortening of all the stages. Adults need not have all these three distinct stages. Number and severity of paroxysm progresses and remains at that plateau already discussed. Physical examination is usually unremarkable. Convalescent phase, this also already discussed. Episodes of cough become less frequent and less severe, and paroxysmal of whooping disappear. So, diagnosis. We all know clinical diagnosis. Clinical diagnosis of paroxysmal stage is more than enough to diagnose this. Pertussis, one should suspect in any individual who has a pure or predominant complaint of cough, especially if the following features are absent. If the child is having only cough and the child is not having exhibiting the typical features of fever, malaise or myalgias, exanthema or enanthema, like any rash, sore throat, hoarseness, tachypnea, wheezes, rales, need not be there in this pertussis case. The only typical presenting feature is that we observe the second phase, that is called as paroxysmal phase. The only the complaint will be the cough. So one must be aware of this condition without all these features like already discussed, like fever, rash, and all those things. So for sporadic cases, a clinical case definition of cough of 14 days or longer duration with at least one associated symptom of paroxysms, whoop, or post-erosive vomiting usually has sensitivity of more than 80%. So next is these are all the complications. Apneas, one can land to secondary bacterial infections causing bronchopneumonia, atelectasis, bronchiectasis because of the ciliary dysfunction, emphysema, and others are otitis media, and reactivation of the quiescent tuberculosis can also occur. Sequel of forceful cough. What happens when the cough is forceful? Obviously results in epistaxis, sometimes subconjunctival hemorrhage, and raised intracranial pressure leading to intracranial bleeds, rectal prolapses because of the increased intra-abdominal pressure, umbilical hernias because of all this increased abdominal pressures will be much more because of the negative intrathoracic pressure, intra-abdominal pressure, all these. Intake will be very decreased in these conditions. Dehydration, malnutrition is also common. CNS complications, hypoxemia leading to convulsions, and some may, because of the persistent hypoxia, some children may lead to encephalopathy. Okay, am I clear? Am I clear?
Yes, ma'am.
Then coming to the diagnosis, we already discussed diagnosis. One is clinical diagnosis, the typical second phase where the cough, whooping cough, paroxysms, all these things. Okay, with that we need to, and one more thing I forgot to tell, the differential diagnosis. Are there some infections one one should keep it in mind is like adenoviral infections. These are also usually distinguishable by, but these are usually distinguishable by other associated features like fever, sore throat, and all these things. And another thing is mycoplasma. This mycoplasma can also cause protracted episodic cough. So these are the two things, most important things for differential diagnosis. After the clinical diagnosis, one must rely on lab for some point, right? So on complete blood picture, what will we see? Like leukocytosis. The cell count will be around 15,000 to 1 lakh. Usually the cell, what type of cells will be raised? That is absolute lymphocytes is characteristic in catarrhal state. It is not. You all know viral infections only lymphocyte predominance we can see. So in here we cannot see like large atypical lymphocytes usually seen with viral infections like Epstein-Barr virus, infectious mononucleus, where the lymphocytes will be large and atypical. Here we see the cells will be normal rather than large atypical cells. So absolute increase in neutrophil usually suggests a differential diagnosis or any secondary bacterial infection. So leukocytosis with absolute lymphocytosis will be seen, and that lymphocytosis also lymphocytes will be small in size rather than other usual viral infections where atypical lymphocytes where they will be large. That is the one thing. So next is culture. We'll take nasopharyngeal swab for culture and sensitivity for the organism to grow. And on X-ray, we note the chest radiographic findings. Usually mildly abnormal. There will be no major changes of X-ray we see initially. Some perihiral infiltration or signs of segmental atelectasis one can made out on this X-ray. And we already discussed the complications like pneumothorax can occur, emphysema may occur, pneumomediastinum may occur. If at all any complications are there, we can pick up it in X-ray very well. We all know current methods how to confirm the Bordetella pertussis is by culture. One is, another one is polymerase chain reaction, and there is serology. But each individual procedure has its own limitations. For culture, we all know we have to take the swab properly and we have to send the sample in a proper manner. I think we need not discuss because we already learned everything in microbiology. Microscopic demonstration of bacilli and respiratory secretions, fluorescent antibody methods. One is specimen collection. That is, I'm not emphasizing much on specimen collection and all these things because you already know how to collect swab from the specimen collection from the posterior nasopharyngeal wall, that is nasopharyngeal swab, and the paranasal swab along the floor of the nasal cavity with material collected from pharyngeal wall. You all know like Dacron or calcium alginate swabs are better. We have to place while collecting for at least of 15 to 30 seconds. So to properly scrape everything and to properly collect the sample. Coming to the serology, we already discussed paired serum samples for detection of antibodies, complement fixation test, usually detection of IgA by laser from the nasopharyngeal secretions. Coming to the treatment part, just these are the indications when to admit. Indications for hospitalization in infants and children with pertussis infection or suspected pertussis include respiratory distress, including tachypnea, retractions, flaring, grunt, and the use of accessory muscles. Any evidence of pneumonia, the child is unable to feed, the child is having cyanosis or apnea with or without coughing, the child is having seizures, and the age of less than 4 months. Coming to the isolation part, one have to take the standard precautions for isolation with droplet precautions to reduce close respiratory or mucous membrane contact with respiratory secretions. All healthcare personnel should wear a mask before entering the room. Screening for cough should be very important in emergency departments, emergency OPD where we attend. So one must be very careful because of this droplet infection. One is the next is antibiotics. When to use antibiotics and what are the antibiotics one must use. An antimicrobial, we already know. Antibiotics is given when the pertussis is suspected or confirmed, primarily to limit the spread of infection and secondary for possible clinical benefit. Macrolides are preferred agents and are similar to one another. Like erythromycin or azithromycin, but risk of infantile hypertrophic pyloric stenosis is more common with the erythromycin. That's why we prefer the drug azithromycin in all the age groups. So all young infants treated with any macrolide should be monitored for symptoms of pyloric stenosis. That is one of the adverse effects for that drug. So these are the age group and these are the doses. You need not remember everything. So just infants more than 6 months and children 10 mg per kg of single dose on day 1 followed by 5 mg per kg per day from day 2 to 5. These are the things. And adults 500 mg in a single dose followed by 250 mg for 5 days. We already discussed what are the complications. Vertices-associated hospitalization is more, and pneumonia is the most common complication. This is the post-exposure prophylaxis. Antibiotic prophylaxis has traditionally been used to prevent transmission to personal contacts of persons with pertussis. The CDC recommends that prophylaxis given within first 21 days of illness be considered for all close contacts, including family members, caretakers, and healthcare professionals. Azithromycin is the preferred agent for prophylaxis. This is the immunization. I don't think you require much regarding this immunization because you were well versed with this immunization. We already discussed in previous, like after 7 years, we have to give Tdap vaccine rather than cellular for whole cell pertussis vaccine. I think this is the end of the class. If anyone is having any doubts, you can ask me. Are you there?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Shall I take attendance? Or else did you give in your
Everyone kept their attendance in the chat box, ma'am.
you already placed your attendance in your chat? Chat. Please give everyone attendance here in your chat box because I'm going to say it's not in order here. Please just give your attendance like the roll number wise. It is difficult for them to write every number. Please it's 17. Only then give 17. So see 143 members were logged in for this class, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Your attendance because I'll say this only attendance in your chat box. I cannot do much more than this. Okay.
Okay,
Everyone
ma'am.
gave you. You wait for 5 more minutes. If any doubts, you can ask me.
Yes, ma'am.
Fine.